Balloons over Broadway. The Tony Sarge marionette book, The Toy Collector and What Came of It. Tony Sarge had long been collecting toys. All of his spare money went for toys that were curious or quaint or interesting for one reason or another. Collecting toys is still one of his beloved hobbies. He told the author with glowing eyes that his collection, he believes, is now larger than that at the Kensington Museum in London. This passion for collecting toys is natural enough, for Tony Sarge's grandmother also collected toys and bequeathed him her collection, gave it to him, along with her ability with the brush and the pencil. Collecting, in turn, led Mr. Sarge to read all the books on toys which he could find. One of these books, by Dorothy Neville, laments the decay of the marionette stage. A phrase caught and fired his imagination. Would that an artist and enthusiast would revive this ancient art of the theater. Well, why should I not be that artist? Tony Sarge asked himself. In the toy collection, he had many ancient marionettes from various countries, and he proceeded to study them. True marionettes are those manipulated from above by means of wires or strings which give life and motion to the figures as they are handled by the operator or the puppeteers. Here's our title page, published, copyright 2011. True Story of the Puppeteer of Macy's Parade, written and illustrated by Melissa Sweet. I love this page and how they've taken letters that look like they're cut from newspapers and pictures and pasted them almost like a scrapbook. Every little movement has a meaning of its own. From the time he was a little boy, Tony Sarge loved to figure out how to make things move. He once said he became a marionette man when he was only 6 years old. His father had asked him to feed their chickens at 6:30 in the morning every day. Tony had an idea. What if he could feed the chickens without leaving his bed? He rigged up some pulley and ran rope from the chicken coop door to his bedroom window. That night, he spread chicken feed outside the chicken coop door. So let's look at his picture. 1, spread the chicken feed the night before, pull the rope, open the door, and the chickens come out. The next morning, Tony pulled on the rope and the door to the chicken coop opened. The chickens ate their breakfast. Tony stayed snug in his bed, and his dad was so impressed, never made Tony do another chore. When Tony grew up, he moved to London, where he discovered that no one was making marionettes for kids anymore. So out of wood, cloth, and string, Tony began to make the puppets. He figured out ways to make his marionettes' movement so lifelike that they performed as if they were real actors. Word soon spread about Tony's amazing marionettes. When Tony moved to New York City, the Tony Sarge marionettes began performing on Broadway. In the heart of New York City, in Herald Square, was the biggest store on earth, R.H. Macy's department store. Macy's had heard about Tony's puppets and asked him to design a puppet parade for the store's holiday window. So Tony made new puppets based on storybook characters, then attached them to gears and pulleys to make them move. Macy's Wondertown. In Macy's Wondertown window, Tony's mechanical marionettes danced across the stage as if by magic. All day long, they performed to shoppers, jostling for a better look. But Macy's had an even bigger job in store for Tony. Many of the people working at Macy's were immigrants, and as the holidays approached, they missed their own holiday traditions of music and dancing in the streets. Macy agreed to put on a parade for the employees, and they hired Tony to help. Tony, too, was an immigrant, so he loved the idea of creating a parade based on street carnivals from all over the world. He made costumes and built horse-drawn floats, and Macy's even arranged to bring in bears and elephants, camels from the Central Park Zoo. The animals joined hundreds of Macy's employees on Thanksgiving Day, 1924, winding their way from the Harlem to Herald Square. It was a dazzling parade. In fact, Macy's first parade was such a huge success that they decided to have one every year on Thanksgiving Day to celebrate America's own holiday. So there's one of the first parades. Each year the parade grew. But when Macy's brought in lions and tigers, in addition to the bears and the elephants and the camels, the animals roared and growled, and it frightened the children. "Tony, can you think of something spectacular?" Macy's asked Tony to replace the animals. "Okay," he said. Tony hoped to replace the animals with some kind of puppets, but his marionettes were less than 3 feet tall. He would have to make much larger puppets in order for them to be seen in the parade. And how could he make them strong enough to hold up in bad weather, yet light enough to move up and down the streets? Tony knew of a company in Ohio that made blimps out of rubber, the perfect material for any weather. When he called the company and showed them his sketches, they agreed to make what Tony wanted. Still, how would Tony make his big puppets, move? Then Tony had an idea from an Indonesian rod puppet that was in his toy collection. So he's getting some ideas. On Thanksgiving Day, Tony's creatures, some as high as 16 feet, spilled into the streets, and the crowds cheered wildly. Part puppet, part balloon, and air-filled rubber bags wobbled down the avenues, propped up by wooden sticks. But now the sidewalks were so packed with people that only those in the first few rows could really see the parade. Tony realized his puppets would have to be even bigger and higher off the ground. And though the sticks helped to steer the puppets, they were stiff and heavy. Tony wanted his balloons to articulate, or to move and gesture more like the puppets. But how? With a marionette, the controls are above and the puppets hang down. So he saw a problem with his invention, and he's beginning to rethink things. But what if the controls were below and the puppets could rise up? During the next year, Tony set his new idea into motion. This time he asked the company in Ohio to make the balloons out of rubberized silk, as strong as rubber, but lighter than the rubber alone. Most important, Tony ordered the balloons to be filled not just with air, but with helium too. Since helium is lighter than air, it would make the balloons rise. Once the puppets were completed, they were deflated and shipped back to Tony in New York. Tony did not know if everything would go as planned. What if the balloons are filled with too much helium? What if one hits a sharp object? Will they fit under the L, the elevated train track? It was still dark on Thanksgiving morning when Tony filled the balloons with helium, tethering them down with sandbags. By 1 p.m., the sidewalks were packed with people ready for the parade. Then, one by one, Tony cut the lines to the sandbags. Let's have a parade! And the magnificent upside-down marionettes rose up into the sky. Nodding and waving to the crowds below, they sailed past Central Park. They sailed down Broadway. They shimmied and swayed through the canyons of New York City. High above the crowds, they flounced in the afternoon wind, pulling the rope handlers this way and that. Yet with every heave-ho, the balloons gestured and articulated like wild puppets, and the crowd screamed for more. After the balloons were eased under the L, They ended in front of Macy's at Tony's Wondertown windows. It was a parade that New Yorkers would never forget. And from that day on, every Thanksgiving morning, crowds have lined the sidewalks of New York City to see what new balloons would rise to the skies for Macy's famous parade. Tony Sarge, the puppeteer who loved to figure out how to make things move, had set the stage with a little rigging for a puppet to be anything anyone could imagine it to be. Some author's notes for you to read, some newspaper articles